In the grand tradition of civilized beings finding increasingly elaborate ways to measure their own importance, the annual Survivors Symposium had established itself as the galaxy's premier venue for competitive suffering and professionally managed trauma. The venue itself, a crystalline amphitheater orbiting a dying red giant, served as a monument to galactic excess, its transparent walls offering a spectacular view of stellar death throes that most attendees ignored, in favor of admiring their own reflections. The gathering attracted the cream of galactic society's most insufferable specimens, beings who had transformed survival into a competitive sport and suffering into a currency of social status. Each species arrived bearing the weight of their homeworld's reputation like a badge of honor, ready to engage in that most sacred of civilized rituals, the humble brag elevated to interstellar proportions. At the symposium's heart sat the presentation dome, a circular stage surrounded by tiered seating that rose like the layers of some cosmic wedding cake. Species segregated themselves according to an unspoken hierarchy of presumed hardship tolerance, with the most dramatically scarred delegates claiming premium positions closest to the speaking platform. The architecture itself seemed designed to amplify both voices and egos, creating an acoustic environment where even the most modest boast could resonate with thunderous authority. The Krillian delegation occupied the symposium's most coveted seats, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming with the particular sheen that came from surviving atmospheric acid with a pH level that could dissolve starship hulls. Their representative, a towering insectoid whose carapace bore the artistic scars of chemical weathering, preened with the satisfaction of a being whose very existence served as a walking testament to planetary hostility. The Krillians had built their entire cultural identity around the simple fact that their homeworld tried to dissolve them on a daily basis, and they had somehow managed to evolve immunity to their own atmosphere's relentless attempts at chemical warfare. Not to be outdone, the Zephyran contingent arranged themselves with the calculated precision of beings accustomed to surviving in environments where mathematical errors resulted in immediate crystallization. Their crystalline forms refracted the ambient light into prismatic displays that served as both natural beauty and subtle intimidation. After all, what species could claim superiority over beings who had evolved to thrive in temperatures that approached absolute zero? The Zephyran delegates' every movement produced musical chimes that rang with the clarity of ice breaking under pressure, a sound their species had learned to interpret as either approaching death or exceptional fortune, depending on the pitch. The Thermonian representative radiated heat with the casual indifference of a being whose ancestors had learned to swim in lava flows, their molten rock physiology serving as a constant reminder that some species had evolved beyond the need for environmental protection. They occupied specially reinforced seating that could withstand their natural body temperature, which fell somewhere between industrial furnace and stellar core, creating small heat mirages that distorted the air around them like visual manifestations of their superiority complex. Each species had arrived armed with presentation materials that bordered on the theatrical, holographic displays of their homeworld's most lethal features, atmospheric readings that doubled as horror statistics, and survival stories polished through generations of retelling until they gleamed with mythic significance. The symposium's organizers had wisely scheduled the presentations in ascending order of presumed hardship, creating a natural dramatic arc that would culminate in whatever species could claim the most impressively hostile origin story. The moderator, a being whose own species had achieved survival credentials through the dubious honor of evolving on a planet with unstable gravity, called the session to order with the kind of ceremonial gravitas typically reserved for declaring wars or announcing the heat death of the universe. The opening remarks established the ground rules. Each species would present their homeworld's challenges, demonstrate their unique adaptations, and submit to questioning from their peers in a process that resembled academic peer review crossed with gladiatorial combat. As the preliminary presentations began, a pattern emerged that spoke to the fundamental mathematics of cosmic one-upmanship. Each speaker would describe their world's hostility in increasingly dramatic terms, pause for the appropriate gasps of horror and admiration from the audience, then yield the floor to the next presenter, who would inevitably begin with some variation of, "That's certainly impressive, but let me tell you about real survival challenges." The Krillian delegates stepped forward first, their acid-scarred carapace catching the light as they launched into a well-rehearsed litany of atmospheric horrors. They described dawn rituals that involved checking for overnight chemical precipitation, clothing that doubled as hazmat equipment, and architectural marvels designed to withstand daily exposure to airborne substances that could serve as industrial solvents. Their presentation included holographic displays of their homeworld's surface, where the very rain could strip flesh from bone, and the soil composition read like a chemistry textbook's index of corrosive compounds. The audience responded with the appropriate mixture of revulsion and respect, acknowledging the Krillians' achievement in not merely surviving, but actually thriving in an environment that treated existence as a daily chemistry experiment conducted by a sadistic cosmic scientist. The delegate concluded with the customary humble observation that such conditions had simply been character building, delivered with the false modesty of a being whose entire sense of self-worth depended on others' inability to survive their morning commute. The Zephyren representative followed, gliding to the podium with movements that suggested their species had learned to navigate through frozen atmospheres where even sound waves could crystallize mid-transmission. Their presentation focused on the mathematical precision required for survival in environments where temperature variations, measured in fractions of degrees, could mean the difference between life and structural collapse. They described cities carved from living ice, where architecture grew rather than being built, and social customs that revolved around the careful management of body heat as both personal resource and community responsibility. As the presentations continued, the assembled delegates began to settle into the comfortable rhythm of competitive suffering, each speaker adding another layer to the growing monument of galactic hardship. The atmosphere in the dome grew thick with self-satisfaction and the particular brand of intellectual smugness that emerged when civilized beings gathered to discuss their triumph over cosmic adversity. In a corner of the amphitheater, largely overlooked by the main proceedings, sat a small delegation whose presence had been noted primarily for its unremarkable nature. The human representatives occupied their assigned seating with the quiet patience of beings accustomed to being underestimated, their bipedal forms and apparent fragility marking them as curiosities rather than serious contenders in the symposium's informal hierarchy of survival credentials. The moderator's voice cut through the growing excitement as the preliminary presentations drew to their close, announcing that the floor would now be opened for the final presentations from species whose survival credentials had yet to be formally presented to the symposium. The invitation carried the slightly patronizing tone of an adult asking children if they had anything they'd like to add to the grown-up conversation, and the human delegate's decision to stand and approach the podium was met with the kind of polite attention typically reserved for amusing diversions between serious discussions. The human delegate's approach to the podium triggered a ripple of barely concealed amusement throughout the amphitheater, the kind of polite attention afforded to a child who insisted on participating in adult conversations. The bipedal figure moved with an unremarkable gait that suggested a species blissfully unaware of proper dramatic presentation, lacking the imposing carapaces, crystalline formations, or molten appendages that marked serious contenders in the survival hierarchy. A Krillian observer leaned toward their companion, mandibles clicking in what passed for whispered commentary among their kind. The sound carried just enough to suggest they were discussing whether mammals had achieved sufficient evolutionary development to warrant inclusion in such distinguished company. The Zephyran delegates maintained their crystalline composure, but the subtle shift in their prismatic refractions indicated the kind of benevolent condescension typically reserved for species that had yet to master interstellar travel without training wheels. The human reached the presentation platform and paused, apparently collecting thoughts rather than launching into the kind of grand opening statement that had characterized the previous speakers. This momentary hesitation was interpreted by the audience as stage fright, confirming their collective assessment that Earth's representative had perhaps overestimated their planet's qualifications for inclusion in such an elite gathering. When the human finally spoke, the voice carried an almost apologetic quality that immediately established expectations for what promised to be a brief and underwhelming addition to the symposium's proceedings. The opening remarks focused on Earth as a reasonably challenging environment, with some notable weather patterns and occasional geological activity. This modest introduction drew subtle exchanges of glances among the assembled delegates, who recognized the diplomatic language of a species attempting to participate in conversations clearly above their survival weight class. The human began with Earth's atmospheric composition, describing oxygen levels in percentages that initially seemed unremarkable until several delegates began performing rapid mental calculations. The methane collective's representative, whose species had evolved in atmospheres where oxygen existed only in trace amounts, began to shift uncomfortably as they processed the implications of breathing a gas that could sustain continuous combustion. The casual mention that Earth's atmosphere maintained oxygen concentrations sufficient to support open flames drew the first genuine moments of attention from an audience that had previously been planning their post-presentation meal selections. Gravitational specifications followed, delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone one might use to describe local traffic conditions. The human explained Earth's surface gravity as a standard 1G environment, while neglecting to mention that this represented a crushing force that would flatten most civilized species into decorative pancakes. The Gossamer Imperium's delegate, whose people had evolved in microgravity environments where falling 2 meters could prove fatal, began to calculate the bone density requirements for surviving on a world where simply standing upright required the kind of structural engineering typically reserved for space stations. The presentation continued with observations about Earth's weather systems, described as variable seasonal patterns with occasional extreme events. This understated summary encompassed phenomena that included atmospheric rivers capable of relocating entire mountain ranges, temperature variance that spanned ranges sufficient to boil water or freeze carbon dioxide, and precipitation events that could deliver more water in a single afternoon than some worlds received in a decade. The humans' casual mention of tornado season and hurricane tracking suggested a species that had developed recreational hobbies around predicting which atmospheric disturbances might destroy their settlements on any given day. Seismic activity received similar treatment, characterized as tectonic adjustments that occasionally resulted in landscape modifications. The euphemistic language barely concealed descriptions of crustal movements that could swallow cities, mountain building exercises that occurred on geological timescales measured in moments rather than millennia, and volcanic events that had historically altered global climate patterns through the simple expedient of launching sufficient debris into orbit to block stellar radiation for years at a time. The audience's initial amusement began to curdle into something approaching concern as the human continued through what they clearly considered routine environmental hazards. The crystalline hegemony's representative found themselves calculating survival probabilities for beings whose structural integrity depended on maintaining precise molecular arrangements, while the thermal dancers started to question whether their heat-based physiology would prove adequate in an environment where frozen water fell from the sky with sufficient force to damage unprotected surfaces. Marine environments received particularly unsettling coverage, with the human describing oceans as significant water features that covered most of the planetary surface to depths that exceeded the height of many species' tallest architectural achievements. The casual mention of pressure differentials that increased with depth drew sharp attention from delegates whose ancestors had evolved in carefully controlled atmospheric conditions, while descriptions of marine life that had adapted to environments of crushing darkness and chemical extremes began to paint a picture of a world where even the water had developed aggressive tendencies. The humans' discussion of wildlife management practices introduced concepts that challenged several fundamental assumptions about planetary habitability. The idea that Earth's dominant species shared their world with creatures specifically evolved for predation and had developed cultural practices around avoiding, deterring, or occasionally engaging with animals that viewed them as potential meals struck many delegates as either elaborate fiction or evidence of a species suffering from collective psychological trauma. Hunting and fishing emerged as recreational activities that involved voluntary entering environments where larger, better-armed creatures lived, with the apparent goal of engaging them in contests that could result in either dinner or serving as dinner, depending on the participants' relative skill levels. The concept of sport fishing, deliberately seeking encounters with aquatic creatures capable of dragging bipedal mammals into crushing depths, drew the kind of stunned silence typically reserved for descriptions of advanced mental illness. The humans' mention of extreme sports opened entirely new categories of concern among an audience that was beginning to suspect they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of Earth's challenges. Mountain climbing was presented as a leisure activity that involved scaling geological formations whose heights exceeded safe atmospheric pressure zones, while deep-sea exploration was described as a hobby that required specialized equipment to survive in environments that combined crushing pressure with complete absence of breathable atmosphere. Cave exploration received particular attention as an activity that involved voluntarily entering underground passages where navigation errors could result in permanent entombment. emergency medical care was impossible, and the primary safety equipment consisted of portable light sources, whose failure would leave participants trapped in absolute darkness beneath several kilometers of rock. The humans' cheerful observation that spelunking communities maintained detailed records of survival statistics suggested a species that had developed mathematical approaches to recreational activities that most civilized beings would classify as elaborate suicide methods. The presentation's tone remained consistently upbeat as the human moved through increasingly disturbing examples of what Earth's dominant species considered normal recreational pursuits. Skiing was described as deliberately accelerating down frozen slopes while balanced on narrow platforms, with the apparent objective of achieving velocities that would prove fatal if navigational errors resulted in contact with stationary objects. The mention of ski jumping, a sport that involved launching oneself through the air from artificial ramps, drew visible flinching from delegates whose species had evolved healthy relationships with gravity. As the human's presentation entered its second phase, focusing on what they termed adaptive challenges, the symposium's atmosphere began to shift from polite attention to something approaching horrified fascination. The audience was beginning to suspect they had invited a representative from a world that didn't merely test its inhabitants' survival capabilities, but had apparently evolved an entire civilization around the principle that existence should be an ongoing series of potentially fatal obstacles, approached with enthusiasm and detailed recreational planning. The human delegates' transition into discussing species-specific adaptations marked the moment when polite academic interest transformed into something approaching collective psychological trauma among the assembled representatives. What had begun as an amusing diversion from serious survival presentations had evolved into a systematic deconstruction of everything the galactic community thought they understood about planetary habitability and species resilience. The discussion of human pain tolerance opened with observations about medical procedures that were performed on conscious patients as routine outpatient treatments. The human explained, with the same casual tone one might use to describe local weather patterns, that their species had developed cultural practices around deliberately inflicting controlled tissue damage for decorative purposes, referring to these activities as body modification and cosmetic enhancement. The concept of voluntary surgery performed for aesthetic rather than survival purposes introduced philosophical questions that several delegates found genuinely disturbing. Healing capabilities received equally unsettling coverage through descriptions of bone regeneration processes that occurred automatically following fractures, soft tissue repair that resumed normal function within planetary rotation cycles, and immune system responses that could adapt to novel pathogens through controlled exposure protocols. The humans' mention of walking off injuries that would require species-specific medical intervention for most civilized beings suggested a level of biological redundancy that bordered on the supernatural. The casual reference to human children participating in contact sports, where physical collision with other participants was not merely accepted, but constituted the primary objective of the activity, drew sharp intakes of breath from delegates whose offspring required environmental protection. Until reaching full adult development, the idea that juvenile humans were encouraged to engage in ritualized combat scenarios as character development exercises challenged fundamental assumptions about responsible child-rearing practices across multiple star systems. Athletic competitions emerged as a particularly troubling aspect of human civilization, with the delegate describing organized events where participants attempted to exceed the physical limitations of their species through systematic training regimens that pushed cardiovascular, muscular, and skeletal systems to the edge of catastrophic failure. Marathon running was presented as a recreational activity that involved traveling distances on foot that would exhaust most species' mechanical transportation, while weightlifting competitions focused on determining which individuals could manipulate the greatest mass without experiencing structural collapse. The humans' discussion of extreme endurance challenges introduced concepts that several delegates initially dismissed as translation errors, events that combined multiple forms of physical stress over extended time periods, such as competitions that required participants to swim significant distances in open water, then immediately transitioned to covering hundreds of kilometers on primitive bipedal locomotion, followed by extended periods of mechanical transportation operation, suggested a species that had developed recreational activities around comprehensive systems failure. The mention of ultramarathons, events that extended beyond the traditional marathon distance into ranges that would constitute epic journeys for most species, was accompanied by casual references to participants who continued these activities for multiple planetary rotation cycles without significant rest periods. The humans' observation that some individuals pursued these challenges in environments characterized by extreme temperatures, high altitude, or difficult terrain indicated a form of recreational masochism that transcended normal survival instincts. Military history provided an entirely new dimension of concern as the human delegate moved into discussions of organized conflict resolution through systematic violence. The description of battlefield medicine, where individuals trained in healing arts operated in environments specifically designed to maximize tissue damage, introduced paradoxes that challenged several species' fundamental understanding of logical behavior. Combat medics were presented as professionals who voluntarily entered areas of maximum danger to provide assistance to injured participants, suggesting a form of altruistic behavior that most civilized beings would classify as advanced psychosis. The humans' matter-of-fact discussion of siege warfare, where communities would voluntarily remain in defensive positions while opposing forces attempted to starve them into submission over extended periods, drew visible distress from delegates whose species had evolved sophisticated conflict avoidance strategies. The concept of scorched earth tactics, where defending populations would systematically destroy their own resources to prevent opposing forces from utilizing them, suggested a level of strategic thinking that prioritized denial of assets over immediate survival consideration. Psychological warfare received particularly disturbing treatment through descriptions of strategies designed to induce fear, confusion, and despair in opposing forces through carefully orchestrated campaigns of misinformation and psychological manipulation. The humans' casual mention of propaganda and disinformation campaigns as standard military tools indicated a species that had weaponized communication itself, turning the fundamental basis of civilized interaction into a battlefield resource. The discussion of human exploration activities introduced new categories of voluntary risk-taking that exceeded even the military examples in their apparent disregard for basic survival principles. Deep ocean exploration was described as a recreational pursuit that involved descending to planetary depths where pressure differentials could crush specialized equipment, temperatures approached freezing, and emergency rescue was impossible due to the technological limitations of surface-based support systems. Space exploration emerged as perhaps the most troubling example of human recreational activities, with the delegate describing it as a pursuit that involved leaving the relative safety of their highly dangerous planet to enter environments characterized by complete absence of breathable atmosphere, lethal radiation exposure, and temperature extremes that ranged from levels that would instantly vaporize organic matter to conditions that would freeze molecular motion. The humans' cheerful observation that early space explorers had volunteered for missions with statistical survival rates that would be considered criminal negligence in most civilized jurisdictions suggested a species' relationship with mortality that transcended normal risk assessment protocols. The casual mention of individuals who had chosen to remain in space for extended periods, living in artificial environments where systems failure would result in immediate death through decompression, radiation exposure, or simple asphyxiation, drew the kind of stunned silence typically reserved for descriptions of advanced mental illness. The humans' reference to spacewalks as routine maintenance activities that required individuals to operate in the vacuum of space with only portable life support systems indicated a level of casual disregard for environmental hazards that most species would associate with suicidal ideation. Mountain climbing received renewed attention as the human delegate expanded on the theme of voluntary engagement with lethal environments, describing expeditions to planetary peaks where atmospheric pressure dropped below levels necessary to sustain consciousness. Temperatures remained consistently below the freezing point of water, and weather conditions could change rapidly enough to transform routine climbing into emergency survival scenarios. The reference to mountaineering accidents as an accepted risk category suggested that human recreational activities maintained their own mortality statistics as routine planning considerations. The humans' discussion of solo expeditions, where individuals would undertake these challenging activities without companion support or immediate rescue capabilities, introduced concepts of voluntary isolation that several delegates found genuinely disturbing. The idea that humans would deliberately place themselves in situations where survival depended entirely on individual competence, with no backup systems or emergency support, challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligent behavior among civilized species. As the presentation discussion moved toward its conclusion, the human delegate began discussing what they termed everyday survival skills that their species considered basic educational requirements: navigation without technological assistance, fire creation using primitive tools, water purification through mechanical and chemical processes, and food procurement through hunting and gathering, were presented as knowledge domains that most human children acquired during their developmental years. The symposium's atmosphere had transformed from polite academic interest to something approaching collective horror as the assembled delegates began to process the implications of a species that considered lethal environmental challenges to be recreational opportunities, had developed cultural practices around voluntary pain endurance, and maintained educational systems that prepared their offspring for independent survival in conditions that would prove fatal to most civilized beings within moments of exposure. The human delegate paused, surveying the sea of horrified faces with the mild confusion of someone who had apparently misread their audience entirely. The silence stretched across the amphitheater like a physical presence, broken only by the nervous chittering of Krillian mandibles and the discordant chiming of agitated Zephyrin crystals. "Ooh," the human said with dawning realization. "I should probably mention that I'm from one of the more comfortable regions." Several delegates experienced what their respective species would later classify as acute psychological episodes. The thermal dancers began radiating heat at frequencies that threatened their structural integrity, while the Gossamer Imperium's representatives started calculating evacuation trajectories from what they now understood to be a presentation given by an apex predator species. The human continued with devastating casualness. "Most humans actually live in the temperate zones, the really challenging areas, like the deserts, Arctic regions, deep jungles, and volcanic islands. Those are mainly vacation destinations." The Krillian delegates' acid-resistant carapace began secreting stress hormones that could dissolve starship hulls, an involuntary response their species had evolved for encounters with extinction-level threats. The mathematical impossibility of surviving in conditions worse than those already described was causing processing errors in several cybernetic enhancement systems throughout the audience. "And our children," the human added thoughtfully, "well, they're remarkably adaptable. Human adolescents routinely survive conditions that would challenge most military units from other species. We consider it character building." The symposium's moderator began making frantic gestures toward the emergency protocols, but found themselves paralyzed by the growing realization that they had invited a representative from a species that considered planetary survival a recreational activity, suitable for juveniles. The final revelation arrived with the casual brutality of a natural disaster, wrapped in conversational pleasantries. "Actually, that's why we started exploring space in the first place. Compared to Earth, the vacuum of space is remarkably predictable and safe. No weather, no predators, no seismic activity. It's quite relaxing, really." The symposium dissolved into chaos as delegates began requesting immediate transport to their respective homeworlds, suddenly reconsidering their entire understanding of what constituted a challenging environment. The Survivors Symposium would be permanently discontinued, following what historians would later record as the human incident. The human delegate remained at the podium, looking genuinely perplexed by the mass exodus, apparently unaware that they had just redefined the galactic community's understanding of survival, death worlds, and the terrifying relativity of what constituted a safe environment for intelligent life. As emergency medical teams rushed to assist delegates suffering from various forms of cognitive collapse, the human made one final attempt at helpfulness. "If anyone's interested in cultural exchange programs, we'd be happy to host visitors. We have some lovely national parks where your species could experience authentic Earth environments under controlled conditions." The offer was met with the kind of horrified silence typically reserved for suggestions involving voluntary exposure to weaponized pathogens. Several species immediately began drafting legislation to classify humans as a Category 5 existential threat, while others started preliminary discussions about relocating their homeworlds to different galactic sectors entirely. The crystalline hegemony's representative, whose people had previously considered themselves apex survivors for thriving in environments where molecular bonds could spontaneously fail, began transmitting emergency warnings to their home system about the existence of a species that had somehow weaponized childhood development and recreational activities. Within hours, the human delegate's presentation had been classified as restricted information by 17 different galactic governments, Though bootleg recordings would circulate for decades as cautionary tales about the dangers of assumptions and the terrifying possibility that somewhere in the galaxy there existed beings who had not merely adapted to hostile environments, but had somehow convinced themselves that raising families in such conditions represented reasonable life choices. In the end, the universe's sense of humor had revealed itself through the simple observation that sometimes the most dangerous predators were the ones who considered their own planet a nice place to raise children.